The Wild West is often romanticized as a land of cowboys, saloons, and shootouts, but the reality was far harsher. Settlers faced extreme challenges where even basic necessities were scarce. How did they survive in such a brutal environment? What daily behaviors helped them endure? And how did the lack of social and legal structure shape their lives? Join us as we uncover the untold truth about life in the Wild West, revealing the grit behind the glamour. Survival through resourcefulness. Living in the Wild West was not just about tenacity, but about sharp thinking and problem-solving that many times today's generation cannot even imagine. The immense wilderness of the territories was not conducive to comfort, and convenience was scarce. Since the settlers and ranchers did not import supplies and food, they had no choice but to get what they wanted from the land. Food in the settlers' diet depended on what could be hunted, grown, or bartered for in the society. Meat was also consumed regularly, and most farmers raised cattle, pigs, and chickens. However, hunters went after deer, buffalo, and wild turkey. The difficulties associated with farming in the Wild West cannot be overemphasized. The ground was frequently stony, and the weather conditions were always unfavorable for the cultivation of crops due to its dry nature. However, the settlers cultivated crops that could survive the harsh conditions of the region, such as potatoes, beans, and corn. These crops were not just for usable fresh produce. They were needed since food was scarce during the long, cold winters when fresh produce was hard to come by. Techniques such as smoking, salting, and drying were important because settlers could keep food for a long time. This resourcefulness was not only about being organized, it was about survival, literally. But what if these resources were exhausted, or the land itself did not yield the expected bounty? The answer lies in the fact that, for the settlers, the goal of achieving their objective was paramount, and they were willing to find a way to do so, no matter how unpleasant that may be. Perhaps one of the most outstanding instances of this versatility is the utilization of buffalo dung, or what the pioneers referred to as buffalo chips, as fuel. Since trees were rare and lumber had to be brought from a distance, dried buffalo dung or chips became a valuable commodity. These dried patties of dung were gathered and employed in burning as a source of cooking and warmth. Even though it may be gross to the contemporary world to think of burning dung, the settlers deemed it fit to burn dung due to the scarcity of fuel. The settlers of the area were also very resourceful in matters of hygiene and waste disposal, as this is part of their survival strategies. The absence of any form of contemporary sewage systems implied that the settlers had to make do with outhouses, which were simple structures with small holes dug beneath them to hold excreta. These outhouses that were so useful were far from being hygienic. It usually attracted flies and spiders to build their homes, while the accumulation of excreta created an unpleasant stench that could spread across the entire environment. To deal with the smell, the settlers had to apply lime or lye, but even this did not help in all cases. The fight against filth and sickness and the specter of putrefaction were never far from the people of the Wild West. Despite all the freedom and adventure the Wild West claimed to offer, disease was a persistent and lethal danger due to unsanitary living conditions and the general ignorance of medicine. Cholera is an example of a widespread and often deadly disease that was transmitted through water sources that were contaminated. The effects were severe, whereby even the affected persons could die within a few hours from effects such as dehydration. Tuberculosis, another widespread illness, was also contagious in the air, and it lasted for months. Symptoms were coughing, weakness, and thinness. Smallpox was perhaps the most dreaded disease during that era. It was a viral disease that produced pustules and high fever, which often proved fatal. These diseases were even more debilitating, given that the settlers could not access adequate medical attention and were often alone and far from medical care. Due to such health crises, the settlers resorted to using the natural remedies, and for that they depended on the native plants. Local doctors, who were mostly poorly trained and had no access to most of the modern equipment and medicines, gave limited treatment when they could. However, the realities of life on the frontier meant that many settlers often had no choice but to rely on themselves and whatever tools were available to them when it came to treating illness and injury. This idea of self-treatment was not always successful, but most of the time, It was the only thing one could do. This, combined with the diseases that were always looming around, made the living conditions of the people nothing short of a constant battle for survival. While the settlers demonstrated remarkable strength and resourcefulness in surviving the trials of the new environment, these characteristics were insufficient to safeguard them from the risks of frontier living. This harsh reality raises the question, and that is, how important was law and order, or the lack thereof, to the Wild West? Law enforcement and lawlessness. The Wild West is directly associated with a lack of law and order, and there exist more than enough reasons for such a perception. The seemingly endless and trackless plains were perfect for cattle thieves, criminals, and outlaws who had no one to answer to since there were no policemen yet. The sheriffs and lawmen, who were responsible for preserving peace and order, were equally as tough and unsophisticated as the outlaws. It is essential to note that modern police officers are well trained and have to go through some tests before being hired, while many Wild West sheriffs were hired based on their reputation. It was less of their legal expertise and more of their capacity to use a firearm and their awareness of the territory. The work of a sheriff during the Wild West era was a risky business, which demanded both physical bravery and knowledge of the surrounding environment. Most of the time, sheriffs were ex-soldiers, cowboys, or even criminals themselves, who leveraged their understanding of lawlessness to maintain order. This often meant cultivating connections with local elites and other prominent personalities who could be relied upon during emergencies. However, the risks of the work were present. Sheriffs were often attacked by miscreants, and most of them paid the supreme price for their jobs. The turnover rate was high because some of the sheriffs quit due to risk and low wages. Despite this, the sheriff played a vital role in the Wild West as a symbol of frontier justice that was as much about law and order as it was about the law. This justice was not always fair and often involved extreme violence without much concern for legal procedures. Often a sheriff had to be a hard man, and criminals understood that rather than facing trial, they could be shot dead. This crude and unpolished method of policing was born out of the frontier experience where people had to be hardy to survive, and the law was but one tool in the kit that was used to enforce this dominance. One of the main problems of the Wild West was that legal enforcement was not properly trained, and they relied on their reputation and friendships, which resulted in rather unstructured and random justice. This was especially true for the saloons, which were known to serve what was called rot-gut whiskey, a type of whiskey that was more likely to kill the consumer than put him under the influence of the substance. Saloons were an important social hub in frontier towns, providing not just liquor, but also gambling, music, and dancing. However, the absence of regulations led to the fact that saloon keepers could add various extra ingredients to whiskey, such as tobacco, burned sugar, and even poison, such as strychnine, which is a pesticide. This rot-gut whiskey was low cost and strong, but it brought significant health consequences. Consuming it could lead to several effects, ranging from simple effects like nausea and headaches to severe effects such as seizures or even death. These were known as firewater, a name that was derived from the fact that the drinks inflicted a burning sensation on the consumer. The presence of such dangerous alcohol only aggravated the already harsh experience of frontier living, where sickness, violence, and poor diets were part of everyday existence. The saloon was not just an establishment for the sale of alcohol, but also a center of social interaction, and could at times double up as a court, a jail, and a church. It was also a place where the gender bias of the Wild West was most keenly felt. With the male population significantly outnumbering females, prostitution thrived, and many women became saloon girls, dance hall hostesses, or performers. These women were paid a small wage for the services they rendered, but earned most of their income from commissions that they received from the drink sales they prompted customers into. Some of them were satisfied with this, while others earned extra money by providing sexual services, making it difficult to distinguish the entertainers from the prostitutes. The frontier towns where many settlers lived were raw, and the absence of legal institutionalization and the abundance of vice made the saloon an important social space where survival depended on one's interactions with others. However, what about the dirty tricks and strange persons who contributed to the legends of the Wild West? Striking customs and colorful personalities, The necessity born out of the conditions of the Wild West made for some of the strangest traditions and left some of the most bizarre figures in American history. Probably one of the most eerie and grisly stories that can be told about this period revolves around one Elmer McCurdy, a bandit whose afterlife proved to be even more fascinating than his lifetime. McCurdy was just an outlaw before he tried to rob a train and was subsequently gunned down by the police in 1911. But that was not the end of his story. McCurdy's body was preserved with arsenic, and when no one claimed his body, the undertaker who preserved it made it a centerpiece for a carnival. His body was put on display in carnivals and sideshows all over the United States for several years, fully clothed in his everyday attire, sometimes even holding a rifle. People came to watch the bandit who wouldn't give up and did not know that the figure in front of them was indeed a real dead man. For decades after McCurdy's death, his body traveled from one sideshow to another until it arrived at a haunted house attraction in an amusement park in Los Angeles. It was not until 1976, whilst shooting a TV show, that the realization came that McCurdy's body was real and was a mummified corpse. This led to a proper burial being given to McCurdy in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and his grave was cemented in order to ensure that it would not be tampered with again. This bizarre story is a reminder of how the Wild West was quite passive and how truth and myth were not very far apart. However, McCurdy's story is just one of the many peculiar examples of actors in the showbiz industry during this period. Another strange thing concerning the lifestyle in the Wild West was grooming and caring for hair. Living in a region where water was rare and hygiene products could hardly be afforded, the settlers had no option but to be innovative. One of the most common was the combination of castor oil and whiskey to clean the hair. Even though this mixture cleaned well, it also made hair brittle and damaged when used continuously. When it was possible, borax, a sodium-based chemical, or rainwater were used for washing, and the surfaces had to be brushed frequently to remove dust and dirt. Hygiene and grooming in this frontier were not only about washing hair, but also functionality. Furthermore, the cowboys who worked under sun and dust most of the time did not have long hairs, which required grooming. Most of them had facial hair, probably to give them some protection from the sun and the wind. They had beards and mustaches. However, grooming tools were crude and included metal, wooden, or bone combs and brushes with bristles from animals. This emphasis on practicality was applied even to accessories such as bandanas, which were a stylish and functional necessity for both sexes. The bandana, or keef, was not only a piece of apparel, but an item that had several uses in the lives of the people of the time. As a piece of clothing worn around the neck, the bandana could be easily utilized as a dust mask, especially in the dusty frontiers of the American West. It was also a very functional item for personal cleanliness, to wipe sweat on the body, hands, or as a substitute for a towel. During a crisis, the bandana could be used to wrap a wound or hold splints in place, and essential when in a situation where access to other supplies was impossible. The bandana was useful and was part of the social and cultural life in the Wild West. Other shapes and hues could represent one's position or membership in a certain clan, while some patterns were linked to outlaws or cowboys. This piece of cloth evolved into a symbol of the Wild West, showing how people had to adapt and survive in the conditions of this severe terrain. But where did these individual practices and peculiarities stand in the greater scheme of things, and within the more systematic and structured events that defined the history of the Wild West? Coordinated ventures and sustainable outcomes. The actual Wild West wasn't just about solitary cowboy endeavors and the untamed frontier. There were also larger, cohesive operations that created a lasting historical legacy. One of the most grandiose was the experiment with camels, organized by the US Army for the southwestern desert's transport problems. In 1855, with the approval of the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, the Army brought 75 camels from the Middle East. The concept was that such camels, long-distance pack animals, all gait and grit and hump, would prove perfect for getting goods and provisions across the thirsty Southwest. Not long after, the effectiveness of the camels was evident in military transports and exploration with their proven endurance and ruggedness. They could transport up to 600 pounds and could go for several days on end without water in the desert climate. Yet despite these tests, the camel experiment failed after a short time. The Civil War of 1861 marked a change in the role of the army, and the Camel Corps was, in effect, disbanded. Although many camels were imported, few had any clear role or supervision. Some were sold, some ran wild, and many were left unmindfully. A few of the camels strayed into the Texas countryside and became a curiosity, an enigma for generations to come. His spotting of the camels continued for many years, with some of them being sighted in Mexican territories. This was clearly illustrated when the camel experiment did not work, due to the challenges of large-scale project development in the intense and frequently volatile circumstances of the Wild West. Another important but more disordered part of the Wild West's life was the existence of opium dens. These establishments were especially popular in cities with large Chinese immigrants. These dens were largely unrecognized by the local authorities, who were more interested in regulating the sale and use of alcohol and social and public order in the burgeoning new towns. Opium spread across the various segments of the population. Cowboys used it, miners, settlers. Everybody needed something to forget the pain and hardships of cowboy life. The availability of opium dens in the Wild West is indicative of the social relationships of the period. The temperance movement, a campaign that aimed at preventing the abuse of alcohol, paid little attention to opium, leading to the continuation of its importation in many Western towns. It took the newly improved anti-drug laws of the early 20th century to put the stopper in opium. This was the start of the decline of the Wild West as railroads continued to be constructed, the frontier was closed, and the federal government asserted more control over the Western territories. These legal and logistical changes did not solely cause the end of the Wild West. It was due to the acculturation of the Native American tribes and the decrease of the open lands. The appearance of new laws and settlers in territories that were once considered the Wild West marks the end of this particular era of America. The spirit of the Wild West, however, remains alive today as a symbol of an extraordinary adventure, telling a story of how many survived in one of the harshest territories on the planet, focusing on perseverance, creativity, and the ability to overcome any obstacle. Thank you for watching. Let's hear your thoughts about these discoveries. Also, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more exciting adventures. Stay tuned for more.